Buenas, bienvenidos a este vídeo de unplandivino.net. Vamos a ver una parte del tema de la crianza y retener a los niños cuando están dañándose a ellos mismos con ira, a lo mejor se están pegando o se están haciendo daño. Vimos en el tema del libre albedrío cómo a los niños, para bien de todos, como que hay que agarrarlos, incluso retenerlos, que está como muy mal visto. Entonces vamos a añadir sobre eso. Ahora explico un poco más de dónde lo sacamos, lo hemos encontrado y saludo a Clau, que está en Argentina. ¿Qué tal?
Hola, bienvenido. Bueno, sí, bienvenido
Sí.
a todos los que me escuchan. Sí.
Porque la llamada no sería posible hacer llamada y este tipo de grabación si no estuvieras y bueno, y también a veces hacemos más gente incluso, ¿no?
Eso, sí, la verdad que es un tema que personalmente en este momento me resulta altamente significativo.
Claro,
Así que,
por eso vamos a saltar, ahora estamos como un poco por orden. Estoy haciendo las traducciones así del 2012, de talleres muy bonitos que hemos visto, ya llevamos unos cuantos, no sé cuántos más podremos hacer, pero y estas las hemos compartido últimamente, pero de repente nos tocaba, o tenía pensado el de emociones, lógica y verdad, que es súper impresionante. También algunas cosas que habla ahí, que está antes del de ética y moral. Pero en el de ética y moral justo comentaban cosas de algo que de repente Clau se ha visto enfrentada a ello, que es el tema de los golpes, de los niños que golpean a los padres y cosas así. Pero bueno, ya lo comentaremos, si no, después de verlo todo esto, lo comentamos en otro vídeo aparte para volver a releerlo y aclarar las cosas que vienen aquí en nuestra perspectiva o lo que sea. Pero bueno, que sepamos que este es un extracto que podemos leer independientemente del taller de ética y moral, que está muy cerca de los que estamos viendo últimamente ahora en el 2021 en septiembre.
buenísimo.
Entonces, fíjate que bueno, aquí las definiciones son muy simples. Ahora lo va a mencionar, pero no va a ser el tema del extracto que veamos, pero sí que nos viene bien ver las definiciones de ética, tratar a otros como nos gustaría que nos traten, y moralidad, o como lo queréis llamar, pues tratar a otros y a ti y a uno mismo, ¿no? Tal como Dios quiere que todos sus hijos sean tratados. Esto es como que abarca a lo ético. O sea, no podemos ser morales si no somos éticos. Y claro, todo esto ha cobrado un nuevo significado, pues, con la presentación tan simple y profunda de Miller, como ya hemos visto, con el alma y todo eso, que sobra decirlo, pero bueno, por si acaso no suena muy raro y no hemos visto nada antes. Pero bueno, vamos allá, dejo de rollos y ya. Tiene momentos graciosos el taller también, así que vamos para.
Bueno.
Here's a more difficult one. So I feel that one's pretty easy. A father and his child is the situation. And the child in the action wants to hit his father. Wants to physically punch or hit his father. So what's the child's attitude? So there must be some anger, mustn't there? Yeah. Aggression. It could be frustration, yeah. Okay. Disrespect. This is the child's attitude. Wants to punish, yeah, obviously. Wants revenge, yes. Yeah. Resents his father. Yeah, I don't know. Somebody hits another person. It's very unlikely they're afraid. Do you know what I mean? Could be, but now we're starting to assume about in terms of what the underlying motive was. If we just take a look at the action, obviously the action has a number of different things. Okay, are they in harmony with ethics? So the child's being unethical. Okay. Now we're only looking at the attitude of the child at this point.
But the child is so small that it doesn't really know that it's being ethical or not, isn't it? It's just...
The child is totally capable of knowing whether it's being ethical. Actually, this is one of the misunderstandings we have about children. We think that because they're 3 years age coming up and hitting us, they don't really understand what they're doing. They dead right understand what they're doing. They know they're hitting us and they know they're causing pain. That's their whole intention. That's why they're doing it, right? They understand oftentimes far better than we do what the underlying feeling is. We often believe and allow our children to get away with murder, as the saying goes, because we believe that they don't really understand when they have a great understanding emotionally of what they feel, and we need to focus them on what they feel. So if I focus my child on what they feel, what are you feeling, son? Like, yes, you're feeling angry and upset, whatever. Now, he could be what other people might determine justly upset. But this is a different discussion. Now we're talking about the father's attitudes, which we need to also have a look at. But can you see the child is treating his father unethically? Okay. So therefore, the child is out of harmony with God's morals as well, because it's not right to treat another person unethically. Yep. Okay, let's look at the attitude of the father. So this is the father's attitude.
Creo que tengo que hacer bajar la persiana.
Ahí en el texto detecté, Iván, cuando, digamos, uno de los principales, un poco lo que te decía hoy, desde que empezás a percibir que sos alma, independientemente de que elijamos o no ir con Dios o desear su amor, ya todo cambia. Por ejemplo, en ese aspecto que acaba de decir, de que no creemos que los niños pequeños no saben lo que hacen.
Lo comentamos al final entonces, ¿no?
Sí.
Sí, o sea, ahora estaban con la actitud de la niña y ha dicho, claro, el público le ha dicho, pero no sé qué, no, pero no estamos hablando de la actitud del padre. Estaríamos entonces, si el público, si empezara a hablar como ha hablado el público, estarían hablando de la actitud del padre. Y entonces se ponen, vale, pues ese punto que has dicho, pues es lo primero que comentaremos, desde luego, que es de lo más fuerte quizá de todo él.
Whoops, attitude. What is the father's attitude? What would be most fathers' attitude on the planet, probably? They'd be angry in return. Hurt. How many of you have had your child hit you or bite you or, attack you in some way? Some of you, yeah. Okay, so you know what the feelings are. What were you feeling? Disappointed? Shocked? What if you'd just done something to the child? What would you feel? Guilt? Defensive, yeah. Controlling, yeah. Unloved. Big one women feel when their children hit them. Yeah. Ashamed. Especially in public, yeah. Bad parent, that's really about shame. What is it? Sorry? Shocked? It's already there. Okay, so now, are all of these fear-based actions, are these things you'd like to feel from somebody else? No, so you're already unethical as a parent when you feel those particular things. What would be the ethical feelings of a parent? Well, there'd be some feelings of love, but let's define them. We'd have compassion, a desire to correct, listen maybe, yeah. You would perhaps understand. Yep, you want to be humble to the experience, so you'd want to look at yourself, wouldn't you? And see what inside of me might have attracted my child to actually hit me. And a lot of times it could be just the fact that the child knows it's going to get away with it. You know, so that might be what's inside of you, this feeling that you should let your child get away with murder. Many parents have that feeling, by the way, that they're willing to let their child get away with things they'd never let anybody else get away with. Like, would you let me come up and pop you in the nose? No? Well, would you ladies, would you let me come up and punch you in the breast? I've seen many of your children do exactly that. Punch somebody, another woman in the breast. Like, you know, those people who have children. I've seen them do that. You wouldn't let me do it. Well, why would you let them do it? There's something wrong. There's obviously an emotion inside of you where you go, oh, it's my child. I'm allowed to let them get away with murder. Would you let your child sexually abuse another child? Would you be happy if your own child got sexually abused? Of course. So it would be unethical to let another child be abused by your child, would it not? But I've seen that happen too. Right? Okay, so the attitude of a loving father here who is in harmony with his ethics would be he'd love the child, he'd have compassion for the child. This is very important. He would desire to correct the child's unloving behaviour with regard to ethics. He would need to do something to correct the child's unloving behaviour. That might involve listening and might involve understanding and being humble, but it also might involve restricting free will of the child. Because if the child is exercising its free will in a violent manner, then you've got to restrict it. You've got to somehow stop the child from exercising its will in a violent manner. Of course, if you do that and then you realise, oh, I've exercised my will in a violent manner, then you'd have to deal with your own actions as well, wouldn't you? Extra. If we might, yeah.
Is there a desire to want to
there's no sound coming through, so just...
Is there a desire to want to teach the child as well as just correct?
Yes, well, that's what I mean by correct. I use the word correct. Let's define the word correct. I call it discipline. And the word discipline comes from the word disciple, which comes from the word to teach. Does that make sense? So, yeah, a person being taught is a disciple. When you're being taught, you're a disciple. So the word discipline comes from the action of being taught something. Right? And so when we desire to correct, we desire to give discipline, which is actually the action to give teaching to the person who needs correction. Is that, everyone follows that? Okay. So that's the action of correction, the desire to teach. Yes. Okay. Now, if he was in harmony with God's morality, what would he teach? God's truth. Yeah, God's laws and truth and the ethical use of free will. The child, by hitting his father, is demonstrating the unethical use of its own free will. The parent, if he loved the child, would have to correct the child so that they had an ethical use of their free will. And he'd have to take some form of correction that restricted the child's free will, but did so in a non-violent or aggressive manner. Right? So, and in the discussion about free will that I gave a few weeks ago, I discussed what non-violence is. And non-violence includes no emotional violence. Okay. Sorry.
This would still be the same if you were the parent observing two of your children doing that to each other.
Of course. Yes. Can you see these principles apply to every situation that we can ever think of? There is always unethical behaviour, usually once violence occurs, and therefore there is something that has to be done by one or both parents involved, but something has to be done or said at least, yes. Whether, in fact, the child wishes for that particular thing to happen or not, actually, because the child itself is unfortunately now learning to utilise its free will in an unethical and violent manner.
Isaac's 12 now, so he's getting quite big and hard to.
He might take 3 people to hold him down, yes.
Right, oh, okay.
Yes, like what would you do with an adult? You might put them in a padded cell and lock the door. Yes, to restrict them from their unethical use of their violent and unethical use of their own free will. Certainly. Yes, so a lot of people think, oh, he's all about love, and so therefore he's all about tolerance of bad behaviour. No, tolerance of bad behaviour is not loving. This is something we need to come to terms with. Tolerance of emotionally bad behaviour is not loving. Tolerance of physically bad behaviour is not loving to the person involved or to the person that they perpetrated their action upon. It's not loving to either of those. Next, John.
So would I do the same thing if it wasn't my child? I'm in a family situation, but there's somebody else's children.
I do it with people I don't even know.
Right.
And of course they're totally confronted with that. A lot of the fathers want to bop me in the nose or something. But honestly, how can I allow a child to come up and hit me without taking some corrective action? I can't.
And if he hits somebody else?
Well, if he hits somebody else, then that person who he's hitting needs to take the corrective action.
And if they don't?
Well, then they've got some things to learn about love.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
I can hear that hiss again, baby. Far away.
It's my so I'm going to talk about it. Yes. So you would, in that instance that Joy just gave, where someone's hitting somebody else, you would give teaching to both people involved in that situation.
Definitely. I would talk to the person who's receiving the hit. I would talk to the parent if the parent would receive the information. A lot of times the parent won't. But if I would talk to the parent, and I'd talk to the child too if I had the opportunity, and it was happening right next to me, I'd probably say something. And it depends a little, doesn't it? Because now we're talking about what is their free will, what you know, and the fact that it's not impacting upon myself, it is part of the issue. However, the fact that it is impacting upon someone else, and particularly if that someone else is a child, it definitely needs to be addressed. If the someone else is an adult, then it would be more inappropriate to act without that adult acting. If that somebody else is a child, it would always be appropriate to act, whether that child is the child of the person perpetrating the action or not. The reason why is because the child does need some kind of protection from the perpetrated act. Yeah. Yeah. Connie?
In a family where the siblings are at each other,
Yes.
and there will have to be action to separate them, like you said, and talk to them, correct their behaviour.
So let's look at it. Detail, shall we?
Yeah.
Yeah. You want to raise what you want to raise?
I was just going to say, sorry.
I'll just draw it first. Mum and dad, and then there's children, which might there's 2 boys and a girl, right? Which is my family, 2 boys and a girl.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Next stage.
Okay.
As they're fighting and stuff like that, and it continues, sort of
So
thing.
the siblings are bickering, fighting, causing problems with each other.
Yeah.
Yes,
And there has to be corrective behaviour by the parents.
there does.
But in the end, it's going to be the parents' emotions, is it, that they're just playing out?
Lo hay, lo dice Jesús. Y esto con él.
Not necessarily, because it could also be the emotions of people in the environment. If the parents have gone out to dinner or something and there's people around the person, the children, it could be their emotions that are affecting the children now. So it might not be just the parents' emotions that are affecting the child.
Yeah.
It could also be spirits overcloaking the children because the parents are going away from their own bodies. So it could be an issue of the parent disconnecting from their life and then spirits overcloaking the children and causing the children to fight with each other. So there could be a number of possible causes. If we look at the attitudes of the parents in terms of what would love do or what would the ethical behaviour do. So what would the parents do?
Oh, question?
Yeah, far away.
About the siblings fighting?
Yeah.
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 I'd sort of be self-reflective, I suppose, as a parent.
Number one, self-reflection. Yeah. So self-reflection is really what? The quality of... So firstly going, okay, what am I doing right now as a parent that seems to create, bang, this nightmare that goes on between my children, right? Now, in that self-reflection, they would have to look at their intergender, so they'd need to look at intergender issues and same gender issues. So in other words, they need to look at, are the boys fighting all the time? Or is the boys fighting with the girl? Or is the girl attacking the boy all the time? What's actually going on? Does that make sense? They need to look at the intergender and same gender issues in a self-reflective manner. Yep. Okay, their attitude would be one of humility first. However, there also needs to be action. There needs to be some kind of correction, doesn't there? You can't just sort of sit down there and you watch them fighting each other and so you're sitting down there as a parent and you're going, yeah, I'm just feeling my feelings about this, yeah. And of course there's now bedlam, they're going around, they're chasing each other around with knives or something. Yeah, just need to, obviously you need to take some kind of corrective action, right? So part of the process is to take some immediate corrective action, but also to be very self-reflective in the process and to own your own feelings. So if you notice, for instance, that the girl is attacking the boys or criticising the boys all the time, and then the boys get sick of it and bop her in the nose, if that's what happens, then you'd have to look mum and dad would have to look at their attitudes towards men and women, wouldn't they? Obviously, the girl is reflecting an attitude where she feels aggressive towards the male and wants to criticise and pull him down. And so she obviously feels like she's lesser than the male. So mum would have to look at the issue of why she feels lesser than the male and then feels the need to criticise the male. Dad would then, when the boy bops the woman, then dad would need to have a look at the issue of why he feels that it's justified, violence is justified under some circumstances and conditions with when he gets attacked. Does that make sense? So, you know, they can be very, very self-reflective about those particular issues. It's ethical for the father and mother to be self-reflective, to have humility, to examine the intergender issues, but it's also ethical for them to take action. They must act to restrict the free will, because the free will is being used in an unethical manner amongst the children. So there's got to be some kind of action taken. Yes? Tara.
So this is my scenario.
Yes.
2 boys and a girl.
Exactly.
If there's only one of us at home, a parent,
Mm-hmm.
and all 3 of them are going off,
Mm-hmm.
how do you determine, because sometimes you don't...
Tara, you want to blame the other parent.
Sorry?
You want to blame the other parent.
Oh, if there's 3...
How did the emotions arrive in these children?
From both of us. Us?
Both parents.
Yeah.
So it would be wise, whether a parent is home or not, for both parents to examine.
With taking action, though, to correct behaviour.
Yep.
It's
pretty hard.
Who do you deal with first? Yeah. So even if I pick Zia up and just put her in a room to punch her pillow instead of punching her brother, while I then deal with the other brothers, the boys.
Firstly, the person who's perpetrating the most violence.
Vamos a aclarar esto para el que haya, es una situación muy graciosa porque además no le da ninguna oportunidad. La participante se queda muy sorprendida de la respuesta, directamente le dice Miller que quiere culpar al otro progenitor. Y la madre se está poniendo a decir, bueno, es que, pero si solo hay uno de los padres en casa, entonces ¿de quién están reflejando? ¿No? Como para decir, no, pero ya no soy yo la que tiene esas emociones y le están reflejando la del padre que se ha ido y yo estoy aquí con los 3, vaya marrón. Y la mujer no lo quiere ni entender al principio y pone los ojos ojipláticos. Y rápidamente Miller le dice, ¿cómo llegaron las emociones a estos niños? Aquí porque se puede confundir. Como aquí la línea, por ejemplo, no ha salido que así, ¿no? Participante se confunde. Miller aquí es la siguiente línea de ambos padres. Claro, confirma Miller. Así que lo prudente es que examinen ambos padres. Pero ¿con quién se trata primero? Y ahora viene el tema, este temazo también. Es difícil, claro, cuando hay tantas personas, dice Miller. Así que vamos a seguir.
You grab hold of
and
restrict.
Okay.
Right? And if that means holding them down on the ground and you sitting on top of them, that's what you do.
When we hold Zia, she doesn't react. She just goes numb.
That's
whether
because you
the
don't.
boy...
Hold her long enough.
Yeah, the boys react straight away.
Of course.
Mm.
But you don't hold her long enough. She goes, if I just relax. A minute later, my mum's just going to get tired of it.
Yeah.
So you sit on it for 10 minutes or 15 minutes, right, until there's a reaction, because there's always going to be a reaction from a restriction if their action has been violently unloving.
Yeah.
In other words, unethical. So the reality is, if our child is not reacting from a restriction, like this is what happened to some friends of ours. they did the restriction thing for a day or two, and then one of the children realised that he could plead and stop the restriction. He could go, "Oh, mummy, I can't, like, this isn't good, mummy. Oh, you're hurting me. You're making me feel bad." And it just played on mummy's guilt so much that what does she do?
Let it go.
Let it go. Smart cookie. Yeah. They learn very rapidly.
What about, I did that with Isha.
Yes.
She's 4 years old. And she went straight into this, "You're killing me, Dad, I'm going to die," and all this kind of stuff. And because she was hitting her mum.
Yes.
And then she went through all this, then she went sort of limp, and after that.
And they go, yes, they'll go through all sorts of things to manipulate you, because children are excellent because they can feel your emotion and they're very good at working it out. So what they often will do, they'll go into this like, and boys and girls respond very differently, of course, usually. A girl generally responds by doing the kind of thing you described. Firstly, she says, "Daddy, you're hurting me." So hurting me,
I can't breathe.
Gonna die. All this kind of stuff, which often is a lot of crap. But it's just something to make you feel guilty, right? So what does that tell you? You respond to the guilt of the woman.
But I didn't stop this time. I actually held it.
So you held it,
still,
and then she goes into
limp, and
what I call the limp phase.
I still held it.
The limp phase is like, if I go all limp and everything, there's no resistance, and eventually you'll let go, So then there's usually the limp phase, and then after the limp phase,
I still held it, and then she cried.
Okay, many then go into rage, and then they go into grief. Yeah. And it's the grief that's the healing part. Then you can let go of them and just hold them while they feel their grief.
But when Laura restricted her,
yes,
Isha was rapt.
Isha
loved it.
Aquí es que hay una palabra en inglés muy graciosa, yo no conocía, que es la misma palabra que es madre, se le pone una S delante, smother, y significa asfixiar. O sea, fíjate qué fuerte. Con muchas de las cosas que hemos hablado últimamente, lo de Alice Miller, luego lo comentamos. Entonces aquí he optado por traducir malamente esa palabra con dos palabras, enmadradamente ahogada, por así decir, que es una especie de eso, pero es para avisarlo simplemente.
I'm close to mummy now. She's smothered in there, and Laura's like, "It's not working." She loves it.
So what does that tell?
That she wants to be close to her mum.
Well, it tells her that she generally does not feel loved by her mother, doesn't it?
Well, she's in competition with me most of the time.
Well, she's in competition with her mother, with you, for love. Yeah, obviously.
Esto es lo que dice Miller. Yeah.
So will she still hold it if she's restricted?
No, she gives it to you to restrict.
And I get all the guilt stuff happen. Yeah.
Exactly. Like, so see if one parent restricts the child after it's taken a violent action, which is unethical, right? And the child loves the action that parent is taking, then you give the child to the other parent, because it's obviously an issue with the other parent. Does that make sense?
Aquí lo que dice es dale el niño al otro padre, porque obviamente es un problema de ese padre. O sea, le das y punto. Ese es el sentido. Le das al niño al otro padre porque obviamente es un problema de este otro. Si al niño le encanta la acción que la madre o el padre está haciendo, la restricción, como ha pasado el caso, pues le das la niña al otro padre, porque obviamente es un problema del otro.
Yeah.
Aquí se ríen,
Hands before mouth, darling.
aquí se ríen porque Mary siempre habla antes de tener el micrófono. Y es eso.
That's how it works.
It would tell me a lot though about if I was in that scenario, if I was Laura, I would go, oh wow, you know, Isha doesn't feel this. She's
not
part
feeling.
of the reason why she might be hitting is that she's not feeling close to me.
Exactly. Yeah, well, it's talking about self-reflection.
Yeah.
Again, isn't it? If the parent was self-reflective and all of a sudden they were loved, they were held and they felt loved, then that tells you what they feel they're missing. So
Aquí es cuando dice esto que he puesto una nota, luego vamos a comentarlo paso a paso en otro vídeo quizás para no alargar mucho y aquí es donde de esto no sé, me refiero, si fueran autorreflexivos, si fueran amados, abrazados y sintieran amor, no sé si se refiere a los niños o a los padres, entonces eso te dice lo que sienten que les falta. O sea, aquí el caso era que Mary se ha puesto en el lugar de Laura, de la otra madre, que entonces esta niña, entonces claro, si está pegando a los niños es porque no se siente cerca de mí. Vale, entonces el papel de la autorreflexión, sentarse a ver, decir, vale, entonces si somos autorreflexivos, de repente son amados, abrazados, sienten amor, parecería que es los niños, ¿no? Claro.
Sí.
Vale, sí, por ahora eso es lo que quedamos. Vale, entonces eso es lo que, gracias a pagarte de tenerte ahí autorreflexivo, a ver qué pasa, ¿no? Y, claro, eso es lo que les falta. Y dirían, sigamos.
So if the parent was self-reflective, they go, well, in my normal day-to-day life, obviously I feel competition with my daughter, and that's why she comes up and hits me sometimes for daddy's controls. And all that kind of stuff, yeah. So when mummy holds me, I feel wonderful. That means that, you know, that's what she's missing. It tells you a lot. It tells the parent. This is why the parent has to be humble. Yeah, very important. You learn a lot through this process by doing it in a tactile manner that's non-violent. You also learn a lot through the process because you have to be present as a parent to do that. It's wonderful. Clara, thanks. Yeah.
In that action of holding them or correcting them, if the anger does start to come up for you though, and you've moved from humility to being angry, you then need to let them go. Is that right? Because if you can't keep restraining them if you're starting to feel anger, which has happened to us with Noah.
Yeah, you're now in an act of violence towards the child.
So it's better it is more loving to then let them go and deal with.
Yeah, you wouldn't like anger, so it's unethical to dump your anger on another person, including a child. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so give it to the other parent. This is where there's two parents, it's wonderful. Well, if you're a single parent, you can always enlist the help of a third party to involve in these kind of actions, unless, of course, there's no third party surrounding you at your home. But this is the trouble with single parent households is it's particularly difficult, more difficult, particularly if you've got lots of children, to engage in these particular, you know, restricting the behaviour of the child in order to teach them. But it's still possible if you enlist the help of others.
And the complications with that, I suppose, is you can't just ring someone up and get them to come over and half an hour passes and then it becomes difficult because it has to be done in the moment, doesn't it, to be effective?
Yes, a lot of it needs to be done in the moment. However, don't shy away from doing delayed action if you couldn't do it in the moment. because the emotion is still present in the child. So you could actually, for example, let's say you're at a shopping centre and the child engages in a certain amount of behaviour that is obviously unloving. So what you do is you grab the child, take it home. So you just stop shopping and just say to people, I'd like to leave my shopping here or whatever, and take the child home. When you get home, you could then engage the restriction in a place that's more comfortable for you. You don't feel as much, problems. And you say to the child, it doesn't matter what their age, you say to the child, I'm doing this because 1/2 an hour ago, you violently hit somebody. So this is why I've come home and I'm going to restrict you now. So you explain to the child, you connect the child with the action that they took and your response. That's all you need to do. It can happen a day later even. You could do it a day later, but it's best to do it within a few hours or within the next hour if you can, because there is a connection of their behaviour with the action. That's what you're trying to achieve. So I would definitely, if the child was at a supermarket, I'd just pick up the child while it's screaming, take it out the door, shove it in its car seat, strap it up, take it home, and I'd perhaps just sit there with it in its car seat and explain to the child. And then when it's all done and it's finished crying, it might be 2 hours later, I then pick it out of its car seat, go back and try to pick up my shopping wherever I left that. Right?
Thanks.
So a lot of times there are very practical things we can do, but we're just too afraid to carry them out a lot of times. We could do just a simple thing if we're worried about the amount of racket the child's causing and the distress it's causing people around us. We just take it to the car seat, sit in the car, wind up all the windows with us inside, a bit of air. We drive down the road into a parkland, pull over and just sit in the car waiting for the child to finish it screaming in the car seat. You see, but to do that, you've got to be an engaged parent, don't you? You've got to be a parent who loves their child and is willing to stop your daily activity just for the sake of teaching them something. Yeah. Okay.
No, I didn't really want the microphone. It's a silly question I reframed. It was just, could he duct tape him to a chair?
Of course.
It's just it's not a physical restraint, like you're saying, the car seat, that's a restraint, but you're still with them in that moment. And
of course there is going to be a lot more.
O sea, aquí es como que dice Cornelius que es como la de la restricción, no es como la de los brazos, agarrarle, pero sí, ¿no? Es una restricción donde sigues estando en ese momento con ellos, al atarles al coche, en la sillita o lo que sea. Bueno, sigamos.
Power if you actually are physically involved in the restraint. The reason why is that there is usually something inside the parent that needs to also be corrected under these circumstances, and it'll be wise for you to physically engage the actual action. Does that make sense? And when we disconnect ourselves as a parent from the physical action, in other words, we send them to their room or something like that, we are no longer, as a parent, really parenting. We're now disconnecting ourselves from the action that we're restricting them with, and therefore there is a higher likelihood of them not learning any lesson from that restriction.
And does that also distance ourselves emotionally, so it limits ourselves from learning too from that?
That's why we do it.
Problem.
That's why we do it. We're angry or we're upset or whatever, and we're avoiding our own stuff generally when we do things like that. The beauty of engagement it physically in a loving manner is that you have to now be present and involved. The other beautiful thing about that is because of your presence and involvement, you are now preventing any spirits from interfering with the process on the child. So there's a lot of advantages in you being presently engaged in the action, right? It's just exactly the same actually when you're dealing with adults. It's a lot better to be physically and present in the action than it is to do something via Facebook or email. For obvious reasons, like Facebook or email, you can't confront the emotions yourself, you can't feel what's going on, it's a delayed response. There's all sorts of problems with such interactions. It's far better if you can have a face-to-face interaction if it's possible, because you get the full effect of the confrontation. Yeah, which is very, very good. You had a question?
What if it's not an act of like outright like violence, like a hit.
Yeah.
What if it's more like a constant niggle, push button until you finally get an eruption? Like,
well, you need to look at my definition of violence, which I've given in the presentation I did recently on free will, because in that definition I call a little niggle like that an act of violence.
Oh, okay.
So my definition of violence is very wide and encompassing of a lot of emotional attitudes, not just physical violence.
So just like, these are not for our kids, but we're often babysit our great nephews, and you know, there's a bit of an age gap, 7-year age gap.
Yeah,
so
and one just niggles, pesters.
The big one just pesters the little one, and it doesn't happen that much at our place, but at home apparently it's all the time, and the parents just don't know what's going on.
Well, I can tell you what's going on. Oh. It's quite obvious. The older child is jealous of the attention the younger child receives. And the older child feels less love than the younger child. Yeah. And the older child is receiving less love than the younger child. Yeah. So it's quite obvious that mum and dad have a different attitude towards their younger child than they do towards their older child.
Yeah. Okay. What would you like? It occasionally happens with us, and I don't.
So what I would do is I'd talk to the older child, maybe even restrict this behaviour, but I would sit down with the older child and say, you don't feel very loved, do you? And you don't feel, you obviously feel like the younger child takes away all the attention, takes away, you know, that's how the older child is feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah. You remember with an older child, generally, there is a period of time in their life where they receive the full attention of their parents. And then when the second child comes along, the older child doesn't receive the full attention. Now, if the full attention of the parent towards the older child is one of confusion, fear, and violence, then of course the older child would like the shared attention, right? In other words, they're receiving less confusion, fear, and violence from parents, and so therefore they probably enjoy that. But when the feeling coming towards the older child was one of love, acceptance, and all of those kind of things, and an engagement of time, which is fairly constant, and particularly if there's quite a few years gap between the two children, this occurs, then the older child learns that it should be the centre of somebody's attention. And then when the second child comes along, there's a big confrontation with regard to the aspect of attention. So the older child doesn't feel loved anymore. It doesn't mean that they're not being loved. It just means they don't feel as much love anymore. And there's a reason why. There's got to be a reason why. Thank you.
Bueno, pues es hasta aquí el fragmento. Ahora empiezan a hablar de otra cosa. Y pues como es tan interesante, para que no sea muy largo y se anime a verlo alguien más, pues dejamos, si te parece, los comentarios para ahora. Empezamos en otro vídeo, grabamos otro y en él pues enlazaremos, bueno, pues por ejemplo en la página guía A3 de la web de Un Plan Divino, pues tenemos más cosas sobre esto del libre albedrío y la crianza, que ya trató en el taller que acaba de mencionar y que también grabamos contigo, y creo que también estaban más personas, ¿verdad?
Sí, Marisol. Sí.
Sí, es muy bonito ese taller de libre albedrío, muy largo, interesante. Y comentaremos esas cosas, haremos algún dibujillo también. Que no se me olvide también mostrar tu canal. Tú tienes ahí tu canal Paradoja Aprendizaje Vivo, también donde estás comentando cosas personales, no personales, la verdad divina, etcétera. Y bueno, pues despídete y ahora seguimos con...
Bueno, muchas gracias, Iván. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Ahora terminamos de aclarar en comentarios, a ver si tenemos fuerzas para ver. Venga, pues hasta el siguiente vídeo, si habéis llegado hasta aquí.